Well, it's great to have you here tonight on this Sunday evening as we deal with what is perhaps one of the most important topics we could deal with tonight, and that is the religion of Islam. And if we have Muslims here tonight, I want you to know that you're very welcome. Please be assured that I have a great love and compassion for Muslims as people. I lived and studied for 2 years in the Middle East and have lived in Muslim countries during the 1980s. My family and I were missionaries in the Philippines working with Muslims, and I have a great love for Muslims as people. And if you're a Muslim here tonight, there may be some things you're going to hear that perhaps you've never heard before. I know that Muslims are not allowed to question the teachings of Muhammad or the Quran, and so for many Muslims, they've never been allowed to ask the questions that we're going to ask tonight. And I pray that you'll keep an open mind. I was speaking at a major university on the East Coast recently, and the night I spoke on Islam, we had about 50 Muslim students who were there sitting in the front row, and when I got up to speak, a student from Saudi Arabia stood up, introduced himself, and he said, "How dare you come here to our university and speak against the Prophet Muhammad? How dare you come and speak against the Quran?" And I had not even begun to speak yet, and he was already going after me. And I just stopped this student. He had told me he was from Saudi Arabia, and I said, let me ask you some questions. I said, you come to the United States to study. I said, do you have the freedom to worship here? He said, yes. I said, do you have the freedom to build mosques? He said, yes. I said, do you have the freedom to proselytize and tell people about the Quran and Muhammad? And he said, yes. I said, well, if Islam is so wonderful and tolerant and peaceful as you're claiming, I said, if I was in your country of Saudi Arabia, the most holy place where Mecca and Medina are, I said, would I have the freedom tonight to build a church in Saudi Arabia? And the student shook his head. He said, no, you would not have that right. I said, if I was in your country of Saudi Arabia, I said, would I have the freedom to hold a Bible study in my home? He said, no, you would not be allowed to do that. I said, would I have the freedom to proselytize out on the streets and tell people about the love of Jesus Christ? And he said, no, you would not have the freedom to do that. I said, well, you see, there's a big difference between America, founded upon a Christian biblical value system, and a nation founded on Islam. And a lot of Muslims are fleeing Muslim countries tonight, coming to America and other countries seeking freedom that they do not have in a Muslim nation. And many Muslims are here in California and other states, and they love the freedom they have in the West based upon a Christian value system. But they do not have that in their own nation. And if you're a Muslim here tonight, I pray that you will keep an open mind as we deal with these important issues. Just to give you a little background tonight, and I hope that you got notes as you came in, the word Islam is Arabic, means submission. The word Muslim or Muslim means one who submits to Allah, their name for God. The Quran, which is their holy book, says that you cannot be a true Muslim unless you submit. Now, the question everyone must answer when submitting to Allah is, what is it that Allah wants? The answer is found in their holy books of the Quran and the Hadiths. The Quran, which they believe are the very words of Allah, their God, was started in 610 AD when Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, said an angel of light spoke to him while he was meditating in a cave a few miles north of his home in Mecca. Muhammad claimed that these were the words of the one true God, Allah. In short, the Quran is not Muhammad's teachings. They believe it is Allah's very words. The revelations in the Quran came over a period of 22 years. The books of Hadith are another set of holy writings for Muslims. These are the books that record the accounts of the things the Prophet Muhammad said and did during his life. In other words, the books of Hadith give the teachings of Muhammad in word and example. And for most Muslims around the world, the Hadiths are on an equal footing, virtually, with the Quran, as an example of how they are to live as Muslims. And the majority of Muslims would consider these authoritative. And finally, tonight, you need to be aware of Sharia. Sharia is Islamic law regarding the duty of Muslims toward the God of Islam. So what is it that the Quran and the Hadith tell us that Allah wants? Well, there are 5 key requirements that must be met in order to be a Muslim. And all Muslims, no matter whether you're in the Middle East or North Africa or Indonesia or Pakistan or Bangladesh or America, all Muslims would agree that these are the pillars of faith, called the 5 pillars. And all Muslims must submit to these. The first thing that is required of all Muslims in order to be a Muslim is what is called the Shahada, or the Declaration of Faith. And every Muslim must declare that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. The second thing that is required of all Muslims is salat, or prayer, 5 times a day, facing Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Now, the reason, as we're going to see tonight, why Muslims will pray 5 times a day facing Mecca is not only to show their allegiance to Arabia, but in Islam, they teach that man is not a sinner, but they say man is merely forgetful. And so a Muslim prays 5 times a day to help him to remember to do the laws and the commands of Allah, as we're going to see. They also will pray in the mosque on Friday, the Friday being the day of worship for all Muslims, and they will gather and pray there at noon on Fridays. The third thing required of all Muslims is almsgiving, usually 2.5% at the end of the year to the poor. Now, a Muslim will give 2.5% of his income at the end of the year to the poor, not out of any overwhelming love or compassion. They do that purely to gain meritorious favor in the eyes of Allah, so that on the day of judgment, Allah might weigh their good and bad deeds and consider them as possible candidates for paradise. The fourth thing that is required of all Muslims is fasting during the month of Ramadan, and we just finished Ramadan. It is the 9th month of the lunar calendar, and so it changes every year. And Ramadan is a month that all Muslims must observe every year, in which they are required to fast from sunrise to sundown. And they are not allowed to eat or drink anything during the month of Ramadan from sunrise to sundown. And that can be a very burdensome thing for Muslims living in the deserts of Arabia, in the hot sun there. When I lived, I spent 2 years in the Middle East, and when I lived and worked in Beirut, Lebanon, prior to the Civil War, we used to, during the month of Ramadan, would stand on the shore of the Mediterranean in the evening, and we would watch the sun set into the Mediterranean there in Beirut. And as soon as the sun would set, all the restaurants would open up, and the Muslims would flood into the restaurant, start eating, drinking as much as they could. And they would have a food orgy through the evening. Then they would get some sleep and wake up early in the morning before sunrise. And a Muslim will then eat, drink as much as he can before the sun comes up. That's called the fast of Ramadan. And that lasts for a month. The fifth thing that is required of all Muslims is that at least once in their lifetime, they will make a Hajj, or a pilgrimage, to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. The Hajj, which is required of all Muslims as at least once in their life, can be a very difficult thing for many poor Muslims coming from poor Muslim nations, where they will save all their life in order to make a pilgrimage at least once in their life. And this pilgrimage, known as the Hajj, was nothing new. As we're going to see, Muhammad essentially took 7th century Arabian culture that he was born into and elevated it to the status of religion. And Mecca, where Muhammad was born, was already, at his birth, the center of tribal worship. There was there in the Kaaba of Mecca already set up 360 tribal deities, and the tribes of Arabia would make an annual Hajj, or pilgrimage, to Mecca. And most scholars of Islam say that Muhammad simply incorporated this into Islam in order to gain the favor of the businessmen in Mecca who were making a lot of money from this annual pilgrimage. But a Muslim, when he goes to Mecca, they go to what is called the Kaaba. And there in the Kaaba, there is this black cube covered by black cloth. At one end is a silver chalice with a black meteorite in it. And the Muslim will march around that black cube 7 times, believing that this is where Abraham offered Ishmael, they say, on the altar. And they believe it was Abraham who built this. and they will march around 7 times. The Muslim will then go outside the Kaaba there in Mecca, and he will pick up stones and throw stones at 3 pillars, believing that he is stoning the works of Satan and freeing himself from sin for that year. The Muslim will then go up to the cave about 3 miles north of Mecca, where Muhammad said he received these revelations, which later were turned into the Quran. And this goes on for a week and is required of all Muslims at least once in their life. Well, why is it so important that Muslims do what Allah wants? It is because Islam is essentially a religion of works. Entrance to paradise, they believe, must be earned. And the sad part is that Muslims can never have assurance of salvation. It's one of the things when you get to know Muslims, they have no assurance of salvation. They believe that when they die, they will go to the grave where they await their judgment at the resurrection day. When judgment day comes, they believe that Allah will weigh their good and bad deeds in a balancing scale. And when you get to know Muslims on a personal level, as I have, when they're honest with you, a Muslim will admit to you that the one thing they all fear in life is every Muslim fears the balancing scale. He knows that there's coming a day of judgment in which God is going to weigh their good and bad deeds in a balancing scale. And the Quran teaches that every person has 2 recording angels. One angel that sits on your right shoulder recording your good deeds. One angel that sits on your left shoulder recording all of your bad deeds. And they are told that on the day of judgment, God is going to weigh those good and bad deeds in a balancing scale. But no Muslim has guarantee of salvation. He's never quite sure he's doing enough good works to gain God's favor. There is only one sure way that one can guarantee entrance to paradise. And you need to understand this. For the Muslim today, there is only one sure guarantee that they can ever make it to heaven. And this is what makes the perfect motive for the suicide bombers and the jihad fighters that we see today in the Middle East, in Israel and Iraq, and also here in 9/11 in America. You see, for a Muslim, they believe that the only way that they can know for sure that they will get into paradise is if they die in a holy jihad, die fighting the enemies of Islam. You see, the word jihad actually means struggle in Arabic, and a lot of Muslims in America will tell you it simply means a personal inner struggle. That's not what it has ever meant. All Muslim scholars agree that jihad means that Muslims must fight the enemy of Allah until the enemies are dead or convert to Islam. As the Quran teaches in Surah 8:39, and the Quran, their holy book, is broken into 114 chapters known as surahs, and I'll be quoting some tonight. In Surah 8, verse 39, we read, jihad is fighting anybody who stands in the way of speaking against the religion of Islam. And Muslims believe if you die in jihad, you do not even have to go to the grave and wait for judgment, but you will go directly to paradise. You see, for the Muslim, jihad is really a contract between Allah and the Muslim. If the Muslim fights, Allah rewards him in the afterlife. As Surah 474 states, let those who sell the life of this world for the hereafter fight in the cause of Allah. And whoso fights in the cause of Allah and is killed, we shall bestow on him a great reward. Surah 9:89 in the Quran says, for them Allah has got ready gardens, paradise under which rivers flow to dwell therein. Muhammad taught in the hadith that for a person to die in holy jihad, he told his followers that they will be given 70 palaces, and in each 70 palaces there will be 70 black-eyed virgins for them to have fulfill their sexual desires. You need to understand what is happening today in the Middle East. And if you don't understand this, you will not understand what's going on in the Middle East. What is happening, why jihad fighters are flooding into Iraq. Please understand what is happening over there is not political, it's not social, it's not economic. What is happening today in the Middle East, folks, is theological. For the Muslim, they believe the only hope of heaven is to die fighting the enemies of Islam and to die in a holy jihad. Well, How has Islam spread? Just to give you a little background, over the last 50 years, Islam has grown by 235% to some 1.2 billion people worldwide. It has grown largely by birth rate, one of the fastest birth rates in the world. This is what is great concern for France right now with the riots going on in Paris by Muslim students. France is now 10% Muslim, and it is the goal of Muslims. They have declared that within 50 years, France and Europe will become a Muslim continent, largely by birth rate. When most people think of Islam, they think of the Middle East and North Africa, but in fact the largest Muslim nation is Indonesia, where you probably heard that this week 3 Christian schoolgirls on their way to a Christian school were beheaded by a Muslim mob in Indonesia this week. The entire Middle East, Arab world, from Morocco across North Africa to Iraq and the Gulf states, encompasses about 140 million Muslims. Pakistan and Bangladesh each have about 90 million. India has 70 million, and I'll be speaking in May in the center of that in Hyderabad, India. China, to the surprise of many people, has 63 million Muslims, largely in the west of China. The whole southern tier of the former Soviet Union, you have Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, the whole area along the Iran-Afghan border. You have some 41 million, and you see the rest there. In Europe today, Islam is the second largest religion in Europe. In Great Britain, you have over 1.5 million Muslims and some 1,500 mosques now in London and England, and it is their goal to turn England, they say, into a Muslim nation. And sadly, you have very naive people like Prince Charles over here lecturing our State Department that Islam is this wonderful, benevolent religion, and you wonder if he's unaware of what happened in the train stations of London a few weeks ago. How did all this begin? And many people have no background, no knowledge of Islam. It's really a foreign subject to most people in America. Let me just give you a brief overview of the history of how Islam began. Islam was begun by a man named Muhammad, who they believe was the prophet of Arabia, born in 570 AD. He lived for 62 years. Muhammad was born in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. At a very early age, both his parents died, and Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was raised by his uncle, who was a camel driver, a caravan driver, and Muhammad was raised driving camels across the Arabian desert. At the age of 25, a lady who was 15 years older, she was 40, she asked if she could marry Muhammad, who was 25, and they were married. Demi Moore was not the first to marry younger men. They had 4 daughters and 2 sons. The 2 sons died in early infancy. And Muhammad, at the age of 40 in 610 AD, said he became a seeker after truth. Sadly, he did not seek after the God of the Bible. But Muhammad said that he would go up to a cave 3 miles north of his home in Mecca, and there he would begin, he said, to receive revelations from an angel of light. Sound familiar? And he said that this angel of light, who he later called Gabriel, would give him a series of revelations. And sometimes Muhammad describes how he would hear bells, he would ringing in his ears, he would fall down, he would foam at the mouth, and most scholars agree that Muhammad probably suffered from epilepsy as well. But he would communicate these messages to the people, who would then write them down on palm trees, on bark, on leaves, on animal bones, whatever they had to write on. And whatever had not been eaten by animals was, after the end of his life, put together into what we know as the Quran, what they call the words of Allah. There were 3 major messages that Muhammad sought to communicate to the people there in his hometown of Mecca. Number 1, Muhammad sought to communicate that there was no God but Allah, and that Muhammad was Allah's prophet. The second thing he sought to communicate, that it was the chief duty of all people to be the slave of Allah. And the word Muslim in Arabic means submission, that it is the duty of all people to submit to the will of Allah. Thirdly, he said there's coming a great and terrible day of judgment. in which God is going to raise the dead, and he's going to weigh everyone's good and bad deeds in a balancing scale. And he will condemn to hell those who were evildoers and give a sensual paradise to those who he favored. It's very interesting that there in his hometown of Mecca, when you talk to Muslims, they like to tell you that Muhammad was a great prophet. But it's interesting that the Arabs in Mecca never accepted Muhammad as a prophet. The Christians never accept him as a prophet. The Jews never accept him as a prophet. In fact, the Arabs in his own hometown drove Muhammad out of Mecca, and he fled for his life in 622 AD. And he fled 280 miles north to the town of Medina. Now that date, 622 AD, is very important for Muslims. When you live in the Middle East, you'll discover that all the newspapers, all the legal documents, birth certificates, everything are dated from 622 in the Muslim calendar as being the date of zero, the beginning of the religion of Islam. He had to flee for his life because he was not accepted as a prophet. He went 280 miles north to Medina, where there were many Jews and Christians living. And he sought to gain the favor of the Jews and Christians there in Medina, hoping that they would accept him as a prophet. And it's very interesting, after 9/11, I watched on CNN and MSNBC and other programs these Muslim imams from America coming on and quoting just a small handful of verses from the Quran. And they all quoted the same one or two verses, in which it appears that Muhammad is seeking tolerance and acceptance of all religions. Well, you need to understand that that was in the very early days of Islam in 622. And one of the problems that you have when you read the Quran is that the Quran is not written in a chronological order. It is simply put from the largest chapter down to the smallest chapter. And so one of the problems many people have is they do not understand that there's no chronology historically to the Quran. And so they'll see these one or two verses in the Quran that talk about tolerance towards other religions, and they say, well, Islam must be a tolerant religion, and they're repeated over and over again. Well, you need to understand that those things occurred very early on in Muhammad's teachings in Medina, seeking to gain the favor of the Jews and Christians. When the Jews and Christians did not accept Muhammad as a prophet, you see this radical shift take place in the Quran, their holy book, where Muhammad ordered the killing and slaughter of all the Jews and Christians who would not accept his God Allah and Muhammad as a prophet. It was there in Medina that Muhammad established the first mosque. In Arabic, it simply means meeting place. It was there that he preached his first sermon on Friday, and Friday became the day of worship for all Muslims. It was always interesting when I was a student in Jerusalem. Because on Fridays, all the Muslim stores would shut down, and all the Muslims would go to the mosque at noon. And then on Saturday, all the Jewish stores would shut down, and the Jews would go to the synagogue. And then on Sunday, all the Christian stores would shut down, and they would go to church. And it was always fascinating living in Jerusalem. It was there in Medina that Muhammad began to receive a variety of revelations. When the Jews did not accept him, and there was a large Jewish community in Medina, Muhammad claimed to have received revelations from this angel of light that he was to drive out and kill all the Jews in the area. History records that during this time, Muhammad led 66 battles there in Medina. History records that in one day, Muhammad had rounded up 2,000 Jewish men and had them beheaded, their heads cut off, and their bodies thrown into a trench and burned. You need to understand when we see the beheading of people in Iraq like Nick Berg and Daniel Pearl and others, that what they're doing is following the teachings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, in one day, he had over 2,000 Jewish men beheaded, well documented in history. He then claimed to gain a variety of revelations, and what Muhammad did there in Medina is over a period of 7 years, he sought to raise up an army that would go back to Mecca. And in order to raise up this army of 10,000 men, which he eventually did, he began to claim a variety of revelations which Muslim scholars call revelations of convenience. He first began to receive revelations that his followers were to loot and steal from the caravans that were passing through Medina, and this was to support their cause. And then in order to gain a larger number of men, he began to receive revelations that he was to take multiple wives. And when Muhammad died, he had 12 wives. Muhammad's youngest wife was nine years old, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Though Muhammad had 12 wives, he limited all other men to having 4 wives, and that is still widely practiced today throughout the Middle East. When I was a student in Jerusalem, I spent almost all my weekends south of Hebron and the Gaza Strip with my Palestinian friends, and oftentimes I'd stay in a home in a Palestinian village with a man who had 4 wives, which was always an interesting thing that we don't have time to go into. But in talking with him how he dealt with 4 wives, that's a whole nother lecture. But it's also one of the reasons why Mormonism is often called the American religion of Islam. It's interesting the parallels, when you get into it, and we don't have time tonight, the parallels between Islam and Mormonism. How both Muhammad and Joseph Smith claim to get revelations from an angel of light. How this angel of light told Muhammad and Joseph Smith that they were to take multiple wives, and on and on. It's interesting, the parallels. But in 628 AD, he said that he received revelations that he was to exalt Islam above all other religions and that Islam must dominate the world. Finally, in 629 AD, Muhammad had raised up an army of 10,000 men. And he took them south to Mecca. In 629, he went into Mecca. And there history records that with the Islamic sword, he slaughtered thousands of people, forcing them to bow down to Allah, his God. And we're going to see who Allah is in a moment. It's very interesting that Islam became known as the religion of the sword. To this day, Saudi Arabia has on their flag the Islamic sword. And if you read Arabic, the words on the Saudi Arabian flag says, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet," with the Islamic sword, because it became known as the religion of the sword. Muhammad died in 632 AD, known as the prophet of Arabia. It's very interesting, after his death, we had for 100 years what came to be known as the Wars of Apostasy. And when you study the Wars of Apostasy, it's very interesting that right after Muhammad's death, the Arabs in Saudi Arabia sought to leave Islam. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so Abu Bakr, who was the first caliph, and caliph means leader. Abu Bakr was the first leader after Muhammad died. He waged long and tyrannical wars against the poor Arabs there in Arabia. And all the civilized world will wonder what it was that caused Abu Bakr to wage such brutal and long wars, killing tens of thousands of people. All Muslims are quick to answer you that Abu Bakr was simply carrying out Muhammad's orders, as he himself claimed, because these Arab tribes deserted Islam as soon as Muhammad died. Therefore, the fight with them was inevitable. And there's an important contemporary book recently written by Dr. Aboud Saad Salabi, who is professor of Islamic civilization at Azhar University in Egypt. And if you know much about Islam, you know that Azhar University is known as the minaret of Islam. It is recognized as the Harvard of Islam. And Dr. Salabi has recently written a book called The Rightly Guided Caliphs, in which he describes the wars of apostasy. On page 41, he says, for example, Abu Bakr sent 11 Muslim generals against 11 cities to fight the apostates. The victories gained by Muslims in the wars of apostasy had one very significant result. These victories deterred anyone who intended to apostatize from Islam. The clear point is that by the threat of death, Islam attempted to keep people against their will in the realm of Islam. Probably the most famous biography of Muhammad is written by the Islamic scholar Abim Hashim. In Muhammad's biography, page 180, he says the following, I quote, When Muhammad died, most Arabs wanted to turn away from Islam. But Sahur Amr stood up in their midst and said, quote, anyone who relinquishes Islam, we will cut off his head. People changed their minds and were afraid. As we go through this tonight, there are important questions which beg our attention. They are, why did the Arabs become apostate after the death of Muhammad? Why did Meccans intend to turn away from Islam? The answer is that they had embraced Islam only under the threat of the sword, because Muhammad forced them to choose between Islam and death. An important book on this, The Ordinances of the Quran, by the Imam al-Sharif, who's one of the leading teachers of jurisprudence in Islam. On page 289 of his book, The Ordinances of the Quran, he says, quote, if someone becomes a Muslim, then apostatizes, he would be asked to repent. If he does not repent, he should be killed. In the other biography that is recognized by all Muslims as the top biography of Muhammad, called The Sweetened by Abim Hashim, page 316, he says, quote, any of the infidels who said there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his apostle, he became a Muslim obligated to Islamic laws. If he rejected that later on, he would be subject to death. And Islamic history books record also that when Muhammad conquered Mecca, he sentenced to death all who apostatized or insulted him. In fact, one of the most famous statements of Muhammad that all Muslims know, it's found in the Hadiths and also found in his biography, page 284. Muhammad said on his deathbed, whoever relinquishes his faith, kill him. This is one of the reasons why I weep and I cry for Muslims. There are many Muslims today around the world that would like to leave Islam. They live under tremendous fear and oppression in Muslim countries. But you need to understand that at the heart of Islam is the teaching that if you relinquish Islam, if you turn your back on it, you are sentenced to have your head cut off. And I've talked with many Muslims who would love to leave Islam, but they live in tremendous fear. And we don't understand that in a Christian nation. But that fear is very real in Muslim nations. One of Muhammad's popular claims also is that God commanded him to fight people until they became Muslims and carried out the ordinances of Islam. All Muslim scholars agree without exception about this. As Bukhari says in his famous biography, page 13, Muhammad said, quote, I have been ordered by God to fight with people till they bear testimony to the fact that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. You need to understand that what is going on in Iraq today, what is going on in the Middle East, with the continual violence, the continual killing, that this is not political, it's not social, it's not economic. There are real theological reasons why they are doing this. They are commanded in the Quran and the Hadiths by Muhammad himself, that they are to fight against anyone who would deny Islam. Let me read for you from their book, the Quran, which they believe are the very words of Allah. In fact, there are over 100 verses in the Quran where Allah commands the killing of Christians and Jews and anyone who does not submit to Allah. I don't have time to read them all tonight, but let me just give you a flavor of some of the verses, and you can look it up. You can buy it in any bookstore, the Quran. In Surah 9, verses 5, 12, 14, 29, 30, we read the following in the Quran. Then when the sacred months have passed, slay the infidels wherever you find them, take them captive and besiege them, prepare for them each an ambush. If they assail your religion, then fight the heads of disbelief, fight them. Allah will chastise them at your hands, and he will lay them low and give you victory over them. Fight against such as those who have been given the scriptures as believe not in Allah and follow not the religion of truth. The Christian says that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. That is their sayings with their mouths. Allah himself fighteth against them. How perverse are they? In Surah 4, 171, we read, O people of the scriptures, meaning Jews and Christians, do not exaggerate in your religion nor utter aught concerning Allah. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of Allah. So believe in Allah and say not three or Trinity, cease. It is better for you. Allah alone is God. In Surah 5, 51, 55, 57, we read, O ye who believe, take not the Jews and Christians for friends. He among you who taketh them for friends is one of them. Lo, Allah guideth not wrongdoing folk. Your friend can only be Allah and his messenger and those who believe. O ye who believe, choose not for friends such as those who receive the scriptures before you, but keep your duty to Allah. In Surah 2, verses 190 and following, the Quran says, quote, fight in the way of Allah. Slay them wherever you find them. Drive them out and fight them until persecution is no more and religion is for Allah. In fact, when we witness on the internet the beheading of Nick Berg, Daniel Pearl, and we see Zakawi saying Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar before the beheading. In Arabic it means God is great, God is great. He is simply repeating what the Quran, their holy book, the very words they believe of Allah, command them to do. In Quran, Surah 8, verses 12 and 13, Allah says, quote, strike off their heads, strike off their fingertips, because they've defied God and his apostle. The Quran, Surah 4, 89, Allah says, seize them and put them to death wherever you find them. Surah 9, 123, Allah says, quote, believers, make war on the infidels who dwell among you. Surah 47, 4, Allah declares, quote, when you meet the unbelievers in the battlefield, strike off their heads, and when you have laid them low, bind them captive. And I could go on, another 100 verses. Please understand, I know this is a shock to some of you, but we've had a lot of nonsense called political correctness going on in our media and in our government, where tolerance has somehow become a higher virtue than speaking the truth. And I think it's about time that we start asking some serious questions about what is going on in the world. You see, America awakened September 11th to the appalling scenes on television of passenger planes deliberately crashing into the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon. Stunned disbelief gave way to the question, who could so carefully plan and execute such inhumane and destructive slaughter? What cause could so powerfully motivate highly educated and trained individuals to sacrifice their own lives and the lives of so many innocent strangers? The simple but horrible fact is that only the religion of Islam could supply the motivation for what they did, folks. And though people of goodwill recoil from attaching blame to a major world religion, I believe we can no longer afford such sentimentality. No longer dare we allow Islam to escape its undeniable responsibility. The devastating acts of war by Islamists against the United States were sadly greeted by naive statements from well-intentioned government leaders that we must distinguish between terrorism perpetrated by extremist groups and Islam itself, which is supposedly peaceful. And yet I could read over 100 verses in the Quran advocating the necessity to use violence to spread Islam. I think we need to face some questions. You know, is not the attempt to force them into Islam the cause of the cruel enslavement, torture, and slaughter of millions of Christians in southern Sudan today? Is not the cause of what caused Muslims to behead 3 Christian school children in Indonesia this week? Is not Islam the driving force behind the destructive riots we've seen in the last 2 months in Nigeria, Indonesia, Pakistan, and elsewhere? You see, we have arrived at a defining moment in human history when truth could triumph if the world would recognize that these Islamists of September 11th were not fanatics, but they were in fact devout Muslims who were earnestly following their religion. And the reason I share this is because I believe that this recognition could bring fresh sympathy for Muslims of all nationalities who are tragically trapped in the system of Islam. And as I've lived with Muslims, I weep and cry for them. It's not until you live in a Muslim nation that you realize how enslaved and trapped people are. No Islamic nation is democratic, and none ever has been. No freedom of expression or worship exists in Muslim nations. And many Muslims now feel enslaved and disenchanted and leave their countries en masse to settle in the Western world. I think there are some things we need to consider tonight. First and foremost is this. And when I was speaking at this university and I had 50 Muslim students and this student from Saudi Arabia who had stood up and questioned me, I asked them these questions. If there are any Muslims here tonight, I ask you the question. Tell me, if Islam is so beautiful and wonderful as you claim, tell me, where is the Islamic society to which millions of people from the rest of the world are streaming because it is so compelling and attractive? In what country or region of the world is this so-called beautiful religion practiced in such a way that it might prompt you to want to move there and retire for the rest of your life? Tell me, folks, if Islam is so wonderful, what Muslim nation is it that millions of people are immigrating to, trying to get in because they want to be part of this wonderful, beautiful religion? Understand, people aren't immigrating to Muslim nations. Rather, we're witnessing today millions and millions of Muslims around the world fleeing Muslim countries for America, for Europe, for South Africa, for New Zealand, for Australia, trying to get to freedom. In what nation, what Muslim nation welcomes people of other faiths in the way our nation welcomes Muslims? You know, 3 explanations no longer work. It isn't for lack of time. Islam has had well over 1,300 years to get their act together. It isn't for lack of money. Islam has direct access to some of the world's greatest wealth. It isn't for lack of power. Islam controls nearly 40 countries politically today. You know, it's one thing for the leaders of Islam to say that what we witnessed on 9/11 is not the true fruit of what they teach. It's another thing for them to show us where the true fruit is. What is Islam? Let me just take a few minutes to explain Islam so that you understand it. The key to understanding Islam is to understand that Islam is the religion and culture of 7th century Arabia raised to the status of divine law. As Dr. Arthur Arbery, head of Middle Eastern Studies at Cambridge University in England, says, quote, Islam is a uniquely Arabian religion because Islam as a religion and culture are one. Islam must be understood in terms of its essential identification with 7th century Arab culture. And folks, if you don't understand this point, you will never understand what's happening in the world today. You see, what Muhammad did was Muhammad simply took the Arab culture around him in 7th century Arabia and he raised it to the status of a religion. And today Islam seeks to impose its 7th century Arab culture in its political expression,